Welcome to another episode of the Battlefields and Bourbon podcast, the podcast where we sit and sip, talk all things Civil War history and bourbon and whiskey. I'm Jack, joined as always by my co-host Elijah. We are coming to you from the historic Bell House in beautiful downtown Winchester, Virginia. The Bell House is preserved and maintained by the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation, managing entity of the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields National Historic District, and the official sponsor of the Battlefields and Bourbon podcast. If you'd like to support the podcast and you like what you hear, consider becoming a member of the Battlefields Foundation. Membership starts as low as $35 and go until you can't give no more. You can do that by signing up at www.shenandoahatwar.org. Again, that's www.shenandoahatwar.org. Click on Ways to Give, and you'll find membership there. So every dollar you give to support battlefield preservation here in the Shenandoah Valley, in turn, helps support the Battlefield and Bourbon podcast. We have an exciting episode today. We are joined in the room by returning special guest, Jim Goecker, who brought us an exciting episode last year about the 7th Indiana Cav East Wing. Third Indiana. Oh, Cav. No, Jim. I'm so sorry.
So disappointed.
It's okay. 3rd Indiana Cav East. I don't know why I thought 17. 7.
Right.
It's okay. 3rd Indiana Cav East Wing. A great book on them. A huge resource now to just understanding the Cav perspective and kind of an interesting regiment as a whole, a Cav regiment. Through a regimental and the course of the war. So if you haven't checked out that episode, 3rd Indiana Cav East Wing episode number, I blanks my head, but it's on there. 7. Look at that. That's where I got 7 from.
Yeah.
Exactly. Episode 7 about the 3rd Indiana Cav East Wing with our good friend Jim Goecker returning here today. Different bourbon today, different topic. But before we get into our topic, Elijah, tell us what we're sipping on.
So tonight's pour is going to be directly related to our topic. It's Filibuster's triple cask bourbon whiskey finished in cider casks. So from what I gather, this is a blend of Filibuster's own distillate as well as some MGP bourbon. And then it is finished in a cider cask, although it does not say how long. It just says a lengthy finish on the label. So whatever they deem lengthy, we'll find out about that. But it is cask strength, 114.9 proof, and this is one of Virginia ABC's single barrel selects. As far as the mash bill goes, as far as I gather, it is 70% corn, 20% rye, and 10% malted barley. It seems to be the standard for all of their bourbons, although it's not specifically on the label. And then age statement, it is on the label 5 years, but then on their website 5 to 6 years. So somewhere in that time frame, but there's a little bit of inconsistency there. If I can get the cork to pop, there it is.
Good pop.
That was a good one.
And we'll pass that around.
Yeah, we are excited. Can you tell the listeners, Elijah, why we picked Filibuster for this episode?
So our battle topic this evening is the Battle of Toms Brook, Virginia. And if you're familiar with the Shenandoah Valley Filibuster Distillery, you'll know that they are based out of Morristown, Virginia, which is just south of Toms Brook and the battlefield and all of that good stuff there. So this bourbon and this distillery is literally situated on the battlefield that we are talking about today. Although Filibuster, you might think the name sounds a little political. That is because they were originally based out of Washington, D.C., just near Capitol Hill. So that's where the name Filibuster comes from. But gents, what do we think as far as tasting, nosing, anything like that?
I don't know.
It's got some baking spice to it, but I don't know if I pick out that apple in it.
That's what I'm trying to decide if I find any of that. I'm not sure I do.
Let's see if we get something off the taste.
Maybe a little bit. It's dry like a cider, but I do like that.
I get sweetness on the end.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
a lot on the end.
It's not bad.
Yeah, the dry is a good way of describing it. Cause
definitely every bit of 114 proof, though. I mean,
but
warm.
it's not.
No,
it's a warmth. It's not a heat.
Yeah.
No. Definitely a winter, like a fall. With the cider in there too, you could make
Fall
a case it'd be a nice fall.
There you go.
I know.
I do like that though. That's an interesting little combo there.
Color's good too.
Sorry, I'm taking a sip. You can definitely get that high rye out of it, 20% rye. That definitely stands out with the spice. Same thing we had last time with George Remus, another high rye bourbon. It seems that all of Jim's episodes are high rye bourbons. But
they come across sweet.
Yeah. No,
Remus was, and this to me is also, there's a pickup at the very end that I pick up a little sweetness, little cinnamon maybe.
Yeah. No, I do enjoy that.
It is sweet, but you definitely, like, now that you mention it, get those ryes. Yeah.
I think the biggest thing as far as the cider goes is you definitely pick up that dryness. Maybe not so much the apple, but at least the dryness of a cider, which is a pleasant kind of pairing with a bourbon because it's not something that you always get.
Right.
But
well, I think the dryness takes a little of that heat away for some reason that it
mutes it
kind
a
of
little
dissipates it, mutes it. Right.
But, hey, you do. I think it took a minute for me to get that dryness through there, but yeah, I thought I'd get more, and maybe that's just my newness to the whole world of stuff being finished in different barrels or staves or things like that. You think you're going to get a lot more off the nose, and I've only noticed it hardly with a rum finish, but only really a lot with like a Chardonnay cask.
It seems the wine finishes really stand out a little more.
For sure. Yeah.
But no, that's a really good local product.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it.
Did I say rum finished?
Rum finish,
I didn't
we
mean
had
that.
Peerless rum.
We had that. I get off there. Maybe not the port finish was what I was going. I get that more in the taste than I do in the smell. My apologies.
Yeah, that sweetness kind of blends together a little too much.
Yeah.
But yeah,
nonetheless, it's pretty. I mean, it's a good.
Yeah, give it your bottle rating. We gotta hear the label and everything.
I don't know. I think it's
For a good 5 years, it's kind of dark.
Yeah.
My gut tells
Color-wise.
me threw in some oak staves in there to help darken it up while they were in the cask. But I don't taste the tannin.
No.
That's a good thing for me. I don't care for the heavy tannins.
No, yeah, I think it's pretty well balanced.
Yeah.
Which, good for them. I mean, I'd be interested to try some of their other finishes because I know this one's not necessarily on their website. But if you go and look at their spirits and everything, they've got a variety of different ones, like a Madeira, sherry, and I can't remember what the other one is, but there's a couple different cask finishes that they offer. This cider being one of them as well. But this one's not on their website. All the others are. But definitely go check them out if you're in the valley, touring battlefields.
Yeah, it's like our only Virginia Valley distillery, pretty much.
So far.
Yeah.
There is one coming soon.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
In Frederick County.
That's exciting. Yes.
To be announced later, huh?
So to be announced at a later date.
We won't want to spook them too much. Let them get their feet on the ground a little bit. But they are listeners and supporters of the podcast, which is exciting.
Is this like B&B bourbon coming in the future?
This is not.
Battlefield?
No, I mean, this is some locals that are, some agricultural farming people that want to get into the bourbon industry and the whiskey and the spirits making, which is exciting. So good on them. But we know our friends across the state border in West Virginia, Devil's Due, and have made a pretty good name for themselves, as well as Black Draft, who we haven't had on the podcast yet. But West Virginia is definitely ahead of the game when I think, at least in this region of the states, with their distillery game. I mean, we said before, Eastern Virginia's got it pretty locked down with those big names.
Kind of builds on the tradition. You have cideries out here, of course, the vineyards and wineries.
Yeah.
Breweries, it just seemed like the natural progression.
Yeah, it's about time.
Yeah, we're well past due for that. And I think, not taking shots at ABC, but just how, West Virginia being a private state, I'm sure their liquor laws and their distiller laws are a little more laxed as far as that goes. But maybe someone will correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. Well, without further ado, Jim, you're here. You're back. We're excited. The Battle of Tom's Brook, also known as the Woodstock Races, October 9th, 1864. When I knew we wanted to do this episode, the first person that came to mind for me was Mr. Jim Goecker.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we are excited. So I guess to get us in there, I don't want to jump right in, but in the grand scheme of things, on the table when you're looking at other battles and campaigns and in the greater war, where does the Battle of Tom's Brook fit in the timeline so people can orient themselves?
Sure. Well, in October of 64, of course, in the Valley, you have Sheridan's campaign. We're almost to the end of that. We're 2/3 of the way through that campaign, which culminates 10 days later at the Battle of Cedar Creek. Within the whole realm of things, I think where it fits is that it was kind of an exclamation point on the ascendancy of the Union cavalry over the Confederate counterparts. That it was happening. If you go across the mountains and to the Army of Antietam, Northern Virginia, you had that teetering at the brink of the balance between those two forces in the cavalry realm, kind of going through 63. And by the end of 63, it felt like that the Union cavalry had finally, become a match to the Army of Northern Virginia. When you get into 64, because of a variety of things, they definitely saw that tip. But this was almost like the exclamation point on all that, because one of the brigades, most heavily engaged at Tom's Brook, was a reinforcing brigade from the Army of Northern Virginia. So this was not Valley Cavalry, it was not Western Cavalry that was being defeated, but also the vaunted the Laurel Brigade from the Army of Northern Virginia.
Yeah, and I think it often gets overlooked when reflecting on those major cavalry battles of the war. I feel like it gets eclipsed by Brandy Station and other battles. But in the grand scheme of things, this being it's only cavalry fighting here.
Right.
And obviously horse artillery, but that's it. And I guess with that being said, and we kind of know where it fits in the whole thing, October 9th, 1864, Tom's Brook, Virginia, sitting, right kind of towards the northern end of Shenandoah County, miles away from Strasburg, where the Massanutten Mountain ends. How did the armies end up here?
Well, you almost have to go back. Well, 3rd Winchester, of course, which occurred in September 1964, kicks off the Shenandoah campaign by Sheridan. So they've been using, we know the valley's kind of the back door that was used. It was kind of a secondary front, which is unfortunate. I don't think we should think of it that way, but it's come to us through history as kind of that lesser area and we don't know as much about. But we get to this point because it really starts, I always look at the Battle of Tom's Brook starting about the 1st of October for a variety of reasons. But the number one reason is one of the two protagonists, George Custer, is promoted to divisional command on October 1st. Up until that time, he'd been a brigade commander, the Michigan Brigade, in the 1st Division of Cavalry, and that was led by his classmate and many would say professional rival, Wesley Merritt. So that he was finally elevated to an equivalent command on October 1st. And that was precipitated by James Wilson, who was a commander previous to Custer, who was selected to go west because Sherman had contacted Grant. He says, I'm about ready basically to start the march to the Atlantic to Savannah, and I need a new cavalry commander, a new commander of my cavalry. He said, do you have anybody crazy enough to take that? I think that was literally kind of the wording that Sherman used. And Wilson had come east with Grant. He was an engineering officer. He was staff officer. His first command was as a cavalry division commander. And that division had performed sporadically. It was, I would say, an uninspired leadership, a competent organization, but not what you would claim to be a top-notch organization. So when Wilson leaves, Custer comes in, and as he enters the command of the division, we have had now, of course, the fight at Fisher's Hill. Of course, before that, 3rd Winchester, they've moved up the valley to below Harrisonburg. And basically, the North River is kind of the line. Early's on the southern side, Sheridan, his command's on the other. And Sheridan has a communication with Grant. Grant wants him to cross the mountains and come over to help him at Petersburg. My guess is Sheridan was pretty happy to have his own independent commanders, but not really in a rush to do that. He also had arguments about supply lines. If he extended any further, he would have a hard time protecting his supply lines because of Mosby and all kinds of background behind him. So he suggested that let's fulfill the 3rd imperative of my orders. His 3 orders when he was sent to the valley was protect Washington, get rid of Early, and eliminate the valley as the breadbasket of the Confederacy. And so Sheridan said to Grant, let me fulfill that 3rd alternative, and in the spring I'll come down and help you, because by now we're in September, beginning to be, well, again, October 1, with his command change. So I think it really starts there. And on the very next day, Confederate Brigadier General Thomas Rosser arrives at Early's command post. At that time, it was a little south of Bridgewater. And he came with a chip on his shoulder. Tom Rosser was not a classmate, a colleague at West Point with George Custer. They were a year apart.
So you're clearing that up right off the bat.
Yes,
Because there's a
they
lot
were
of
not
confusion.
roommates. Correct. He's not a roommate. In Custer's own writings, he mentions Rosser once, and that is that he was one of the Southern officers or cadets who left to go south. So again, he was an acquaintance. They they lived next door to each other. I think they both had an affinity for horses. Rosser was an excellent horseman, as was Custer, although Rosser really gravitated to the artillery. So when he came south, he actually came in as an artillery officer in the Confederate Army. And actually, Stuart wanted him as a cavalry officer, offered him to be a colonel of the 5th Virginia. And he told Stuart, no, I don't want to do that. And Rosser did have this streak of independence in him. So when he said he didn't want to do it, he actually meant it. He wasn't playing hard to get, but he finally was convinced to take the command. But he had threatened to resign over being promoted from captain of artillery to a colonel of cavalry.
Wow.
So he was kind of a cocksure young man. By this point in the war, he was still in command of a brigade. He thought he should have been a major general and at least a divisional commander by this point. But he comes in, and he always had a very strong opinion of himself and his abilities and his men. He comes in, he basically kind of starts chiding Early's officers and his cavalry. He said, why are you letting these northern horsemen push you around like that? We didn't allow that in the East. We showed them how it was done. So he came in and made a couple, let's say, unhappy people when he came in.
Abrasive comments.
A little bit of abrasive comments. But his brigade then follows up and arrives on the 5th. So when we're talking about October 9th being the battle, this is the build-up here at the 5th. What happens and then also what happens in there is on the 3rd, Sheridan's fair-haired boy, I guess we can call him, certainly a very good family friend, and more importantly, the son of the Quartermaster General of the United States Army, Montgomery Meigs' son, is killed near Dayton. And that hurt Meigs. It infuriated Sheridan. He actually wanted to burn all the houses around Dayton within a 5-mile radius and gave the order. Custer slow-rolled that a little bit. Some houses were burned, but he was able to slow-roll it a little bit before Meigs realized, or not Meigs, but Sheridan realized he shouldn't do that and remanded his orders. So you've got a lot of animosity at that point. And then on the 5th or the 6th, I should say, of October, Early's men have been sitting on the south side of North River looking across and seeing all the smoke rising, knowing something pretty big was happening, that there was a lot of destruction going on. But they crossed. Sheridan starts pulling back, and the cavalry start pulling back. The infantry had already marched off. They were herding cattle and sheep and everything north. So again, the rear guard was made up entirely of Union cavalry. Merritt's division was basically on the Valley Pike to about Middle Road. And then Custer's division, the 3rd Division, would have the northern route, the back road, kind of from Little North Mountain to Middle Road. That was roughly their areas of operation. But as they pulled back, the Confederate soldiers and cavalrymen came across, and for the first time, they saw the true level of destruction of the burning. For many of the men, a lot of them were from the valley. This was devastating, and you can imagine how angry they would have been. Perhaps almost out of control, military control. So as the retreat pulls back, as Sheridan pulls back, the infantry are out front. The cavalry are given the responsibility for the rest of the burning north. And cavalry are also herding sheep, cattle, everything else that they can move. They're moving that north with them. So it's part cow herd, sheep herd, part military organization, and part rear guard defending against some very angry, upset Confederate soldiers who are coming up behind them. So that starts already on the 6th. And what happens on the 6th is the burning, and they get to an area called Brock's Gap. Coots Store is another site. It's out on the western edge. It's out on the back road. And this is where, and again, and we'll break that down, on following Custer is Rosser's division, and along the back road is a small division under Lomax. You don't have a lot of contact and a lot of conflict between Merritt and Lomax, simply because Merritt's got 3,500 men and Lomax has 800. He's in command of the Valley Cavalry, as they were called. Very poorly armed, very poorly led, very poorly disciplined. Lomax had been put in command, hopefully, to bring some order to that. He didn't have enough time, and I'm not sure it could have been done. But again, with 800, they're armed with infield rifles, muzzle-loading rifles on horse.
On cavalry, wow.
Yeah, no carbines, very few pistols, no sabers. They're really mounted infantry at best. And that would have been if they'd have been well officered. But again, unfortunately, they were not. They struggled with that.
Now, was that Rosser or Lomax?
That would have been Lomax with the Valley Cavalry.
On the Valley Pike?
Yes.
Okay.
On the Valley Pike. And Merritt is, again, so for the next 2 days as we lead up to the October 9th, you don't hear much fighting out on the turnpike. There's clashes. They're pushing Merritt. They're trying to nip off and do whatever they can. There's all kinds of atrocities committed. We know a lot about the burning and things that were done, houses that got burned accidentally and on purpose, and of course the barns and the granaries and the mills. Mm-hmm. But as angry as they were, they had no compulsion that if they caught some Union cavalrymen out burning, if they caught them, they killed them. There was no trial. There was no prison camp for you. It was no quarter. Wow. There is literally an account on the back road, and we don't know exactly where, but it would have been south of Tom's Brook, where at least 4 different Confederate cavalrymen in Rosser's command from 4 different regiments talk about an execution that occurred. So that implies that it may have been an organized, formal execution when you have 4 men, 4 different regiments.
Would have all seen it.
Who all have seen it and reported on it. So there was an anger. There was also the Meigs thing with the burning. We could go 2 or 3 other incidents. One was near Berryville, where in August, where Mosby had retaliated against what had happened earlier. You had it in Front Royal, where the Union command had executed 8 men who were Mosby's men, or some of them were. So this attitude, I mean, it had become a no quarters fighting, particularly after the burning.
And it's interesting, too, that you see that when you read about Tom's Brook, such this chivalrous interaction between Custer and Rosser, if they're, giving each other this nod, but at the same time, they both, at least the men under them, hate each other's guts.
At that point, that would be exactly right. I think you had this, and I forget the Latin term, it doesn't matter, but the joy of the fight. Mm-hmm. And Custer and Rosser epitomized that. So for them, it was the reason for living.
This gentlemanly kind of affair while their men below them are just ravenous dogs.
And at the same time, you have this really intense battle going on underneath them and around them. But you get it quickly at Brock's Gap. Rosser saw an opportunity because, again, what you had was the majority of Custer's command was leading. In between was a big herd of, at one time, 200 or 2,000 cattle.
Wow.
Several hundred heads of sheep. And I don't know if you can herd hogs, but what few they could, they had them in the mix too. And they were literally trying to move these north. So at Brock's Gap, as they were crossing the river, or at that time, not Mill Creek, it was at Brock's Gap, I'm sorry. that what happens there is that 2 regiments are left on the south side of the river to protect the crossing, and Rosser saw his opportunity. So they attacked and cut off 75 men and chased them up in a little mountain, and were able to capture part of the cattle herd that they were protecting. So that kind of honked off Sheridan.
Mm-hmm.
So the next day, they get up to an area called Mill Creek, and a similar situation occurred, except this time nobody knows. But when they crossed the creek with the herd, someone gave the order to halt. So now the rear guard is hung up once again on the wrong side of the river of Mill Creek, and they're flanked. Mill Creek is a hard-based creek, lots of fords, and of course Confederate troops knew a lot of them were from the valley, so they knew the ways over. So they flanked them there and got about 75 head of sheep and several traveling forges, which were very important. Of course, you wanted to shoe horses and what have you, and a number of other pieces. And that would have been on October 7th. On October 8th, they moved back, Custer's command, and now Merritt, of course, is moving in tandem. He gets to about Woodstock, whereas Custer's going to get back to Tumbling Run, which is on the far western edge of the old Fisher's Hill battle of barely a month before. Sheridan was not a patient man. He was not a patient commander. He had a temper, the Irish temper. He had high standards. He had high expectations. He'd already replaced one cavalry divisional commander after Fisher's Hill, and he was certainly not afraid to make changes. Well, he let that anger out on Alfred T. Archimedes Torbert, his chief of cavalry, probably the best name in the Civil War. He called Torbert in and basically read him the riot act for having lost the traveling forges and what have you. Why are you letting them nip at our heels like this? And he chewed him up one side and down the other. And at the very end of it says, tomorrow, you go whip those guys or get whipped yourself. And Torbert left. He was not a happy man. No one likes to be dressed down. He came back out and he called Merritt and Custer and said, boys, tomorrow we're going to take care of this. What he didn't tell me is my job's on the line. But, they could read between the lines what something was going on. So that's your build-up or the kind of the lead into the morning October 9th. And I might add on the evening of the 8th, Custer did go up to Tumbling Run. Rosser had followed him past Tom's Brook and was still pressuring him. Rosser had orders to stay in contact and to push the Union soldiers as far north as he could. What I don't think Rosser really understood or accepted was, and he was giving license to do that. He was not a ironclad order. So he gets himself basically 20 to 25 miles ahead of Early's army with 1,400 men on the back road.
Risky business.
Lomax is the same way. He's got 800 men, almost as far north. Rosser in later years would argue that my orders were to pursue. I had no choice. I had to do this, whatever. Most people, if you read the orders, would go, no, you had latitude. You could have done some other things. But what it did, it got him in a position where Merritt had heard some shooting over at that point, the back road and the Valley Pike are only about 3 miles away. So he could hear some things going on. So he sent a brigade over to Tom's Brook. And now Rosser's cut off. He's now trapped between Merritt's brigade there, I think it was Lowell's brigade, and Custer. And I think Rosser realized it's time to go home. I need to go get out of here. And there was a fairly significant pitched fight where Rosser's troopers had to cut their way through the Union troopers to get back to Tom's Brook. That evening, they set up camp on Kaufman Hill. Kaufman Hill is just the rise south of Tom's Brook. Tom's Brook runs out of North Mountain, runs across through the town of Tom's Brook, and eventually into the Shenandoah. And it meanders, obviously, but the Kaufman, if you look at it, is a pretty significant location. It's a pretty significant looking defensive position. Mm-hmm. And Rosser gets there and looks at, see how this is where we're going to camp tonight. Remember, the last 3 or 4 days, the scenario is you got up, you send out scouts and make contact because the Union troops are moving south or north. And then you would attack. He assumed that pattern would continue the next morning. He obviously was not aware of the Sheridan-Torbert conversation. So the very next morning, he sends out, his pickets are out, and they run into Custer's men coming back at him. That's new. Rosser could not have been expecting that. So if you know the area, the back road, there's Mount Olive. This is about where that first contact occurred around Mount Olive, and they come galloping back and tell Rosser, they're coming towards us. We weren't chasing them, they're chasing us. So again, Rosser is now aware. He sets up his troops on Kaufman Hill. You would have had Munford's brigade hard against the North Mountain, and then the Laurel Brigade was a little further east. The problem was, I said about 3 miles. He has about 1,400 men. Lomax has 800. They can't connect.
You can't.
You can't connect. So his flank, his right flank, is now in the air, and the reality is his left flank was as well. But he made a decision. I'm going to stay here and fight. I'm not going to back away. Again, joy of the battle, very aggressive. I'm going to stand here. He had a very, very small brigade, Payne's brigade, about 350 men. And he parked them on the backside of Kaufman as his mounted reserve. He had one battery of artillery, familiar name to those who know 3rd Winchester and what have you, Breathitt. Breathitt's battery was sitting on top of Kaufman and then scattered out. But his front could have been no more than a half a mile, maybe, if he was lucky. And that's in cavalry formation. In other words, dismounted 15 feet apart, every 4th man holding horse, etc. So he had a pretty thin line. And they remark, as they watched the advancing Union troops, they said the hills were covered with bluecoats. They had seen it. They knew immediately they were in some trouble. There's at that time, Custer was commanding about 3,000 men. So they're coming over the hills and hollers, coming at them down the back road and across the hills. Meanwhile, over on the pike, Merritt had, of course, had the same orders as Custer. He turns around and he's pushing Lomax back. Might mention, too, that it's a sleety, cold morning. There had actually been snow on the 8th. So a little atypical weather, obviously.
That early in October.
Yeah, that early in October. So these guys, it's foggy. They're not very comfortable. And here come these bluecoats in significant numbers, but the fog also shrouds the Confederate position, and Merritt didn't know for sure how many he was dealing with. He knew it. He had some idea, but again, didn't know their disposition, how to do it. So Lomax has 2 small brigades. Thompson was on as we were to look look north, Thompson was on the left. Johnson was on the right, again, about 400 men apiece. If you were to go down the Valley Pike and you go to the Shenandoah County Park, that's where the Virginia Civil War Trails marker is. But actually, that's probably fairly close to, at least it would have been Johnson's position. Sheridan also told Torbert he was going to be watching. There's a local promontory, Round Hill. And Sheridan, bright and early, was sitting on the Round Hill with his telescopes and staff, and he could see both positions, and he was going to keep track of the battle. So this is evolving now. It's sunlight. There's been some intermittent skirmishing back and forth, feeling each other out and what have you. By this point, Merritt says, okay, I'll start pushing a little harder. And on the back road, Custer's getting himself organized, trying to figure out how to take this position. And that's when that unusual, you talked about earlier, that very unusual, almost out of character event occurred. They knew each other. They knew each other by sight, obviously. They've been at school together for years. And Custer is sitting on top of the adjacent hill, and he sees Rosser and his staff riding. He recognizes his form. And Custer is delighted. They had fought against each other a couple of times, but this was going to be the first time where they were both in full command against each other.
For sure.
One-on-one. So Custer actually rides forward to the crest of the hill and actually down a little bit to make sure everybody could see him. Of course, he has his blonde hair and his red bandana, and, he's very flamboyant. And Rosser, of course, is drawn to what's going on, or who is that. And Custer, who is quite the horseman, I think probably had trained his horse. He had the horse bow, but more importantly, he takes his hat off and does a big bow to Rosser. So two things would go your mind. Is this guy crazy? Or what's going on
or
here?
Arrogant.
Rosser, though, responds in kind. He looks at his staff, see that man over there, that's Custer. We're going to have to bust him today. But then he rides forward and returns the salute. He bows, he doffs his hat to him, and it's like the old jousts of the Middle Ages that they had met, they had saluted each other, and now we're going back to the lists and have at it.
What was the men in the ranks, reaction to this?
That's a good question, because I don't know how many people actually saw it.
Yeah,
I would think from where Custer would have done his bow, what have you, would have been less visible to Union troops, whereas Rosser probably was more visible to the Confederates. But they would have also seen Custer's gestures, so they would recognize this. And I think they would have seen it as, oh, Rosser, wow, what a guy. He's his chivalry, his honor here being on display. He's, acknowledging his enemy in a very age-old gesture. So I think they would have actually accepted that as pretty cool. Custer, Custer liked to ride around and draw attention to himself.
Well, that was going to lead me to my next question. Do we know if Custer knew Rosser was there? Or
yes.
Okay.
Oh, absolutely.
So
he
Custer
could see.
knew.
Yeah.
Okay.
That distance apart is a.
It's only about 100 yards.
It's going to be a little more now. I was going to say 300, but yeah, from crest to crest, but it's not very far.
Yeah.
And they'd known each other. I'm sure he had seen each other on horseback. They see each other's form and frame and what have you. So, yeah, Custer knew right away. And then as soon as Rosser saw it, he realized that was Custer and returned the salute. So it's now the stage is set. Custer has extended his lines further to the east. He did not hook up with Merritt, but he could certainly extend further than
Lomax.
Well, no, Rosser. Excuse me. Brain.
There's a lot of guys here.
Yeah.
Too many to keep track.
But Rosser, again, couldn't extend as far. He's now probing him with attacks along the skirmish line. They've gone against them at the back road. Not really making much headway, but then there is found a path out across Northern Mountain, about a couple hundred yards into the wooded area. There was a glen, big open area, and he actually snuck an entire brigade. He sends Wells' brigade out to the west through that glade, and they come up about where the artillery position was, Breathitt's artillery, behind Rosser's lines. So as soon as Rosser sets off his attack, Custer grabs the guidon of the 5th New York, not the 6th, the 5th. They go chart his escort and whoever else is free, and they come pounding and across at the back road. So already Rosser's in a little bit of a pinch. He's getting hit front and left flank.
And that's really with Mumford's guys, right?
Yes,
so if we shift,
that's correct. Munford is on that side getting flanked.
So if we shift down Rosser's line a little bit, we've got the Laurel Brigade.
Right.
What's happening at the same time as this?
As all that noise is happening, Merritt is moving north, and he hears all this noise, so he orders Kidd, which happens to be the Michigan Brigade, Custer's old command, the Michigan Brigade, now under Colonel Kidd, and he sends them west, and they hit Rosser's right flank, the Laurel Brigade. So essentially, you now have a three-sized box on the Confederate forces on Kaufman Hill.
Hey, you've got Custer's main force coming head on.
Yeah.
From north to south, you've got Wells's guys coming in the Confederate left, rear.
Right.
And then you're saying Merritt on the pike hears the commotion and sends Kidd's brigade from the Valley Pike west towards the back road to take on that.
Because there's no connection there. That's that hanging flank. So he's able to come in almost virtually undetected.
Oh, 100%. Just move cross country where the modern day 81 is today.
Yep. And Merritt's looking at this and I don't need everybody. It sounds like there's fighting over there and it sounds like kind of considerable. So I'll send him over there. In the meantime, he's hitting Lomax down on the Valley Turnpike on flank.
Yeah, so what's happening there on the pike?
Yeah, what happens there is that Merritt moves forward. He hears this. He sends one brigade over. He sends Devon, who is a very well-respected brigade commander in the Union Army. He sent him to his right. He now becomes the right flank, and he comes in on Lomax's left flank. And then the 3rd Brigade is advancing down the pike. So again, 800 men, poorly led. It's really actually pretty interesting. They put up a fairly decent resistance for a little while, but then they're just overwhelmed. And then it becomes off to the races. And about that time that's happening, and the races are beginning at the pike, back on the back road, the Confederates, we've been flanked. They're running to, if you were dismounted, you had to try and find your horse, hope your horse holder kept the horse near enough that you could mount. And you literally now have a horse race across the breadth of from the pike all the way over North Mountain, all the way down. Now on the pike, Lomax made it all the way down to Reams Bottom.
Memes Bottom.
Yeah.
So just south of Mount Jackson.
Yeah, it's about 20 miles.
Wow.
And there was a very short attempt. Again, I give Lomax men credit for not being considered very good. They actually get organized in Woodstock briefly. They put up a little bit of it, but there weren't enough men, and everybody's moving. The horses are tired already. The cavalry horses for the Southern forces, for even the Laurel Brigade, were tired. They had ridden over from Petersburg and then thrown right into campaign. They were not given any chance to recruit from that travel either. So they only ran to Columbia Furnace, which is about 12, 13 miles. But within this, you lose everything. If you're Lomax, if you're Rosser, you're getting that evening back. And Lomax had 6 guns that the day started. He had 1.
Wow.
He did better than Rosser.
And the odds were really more stacked against
Lomax
on the pike.
Yeah, and that, again, he lost them incrementally. They pulled back. They'd set up 2 guns, and then they'd send 2 more down the road and set up, and then they'd retreat. So they did a fighting retreat. It was just the rapid pace of the pursuit was such they just couldn't gather enough support to protect them. They were basically naked out there, batteries with no support.
And it's interesting when you look at the battle map, you would think that just if you have an understanding of the history of the valley, that the main fighting would be along the Valley Pike, when it would turn out that it's more so along Back Road with Rosser's men. And the fact that it's called the Battle of Tom's Brook, you would think, why isn't it called Mount Olive or anything closer?
Tom's Brook does run that way.
Yeah, but it kind of terminates there at the end. But it's just interesting because it feels like when you look at the map, you're thinking your focus is more so towards the town of Tom's Brook and Lomax, where that's not so much the bulk of the fighting as much as, Rosser over there to your west.
I have a theory with that. The more of the fighting may have taken place on the pike if that's where Custer was. Custer being Custer, already on the back road.
Just being aggressive with it.
Yeah, I mean, if you flip Merritt and Custer,
naturally,
the result is still the same, but your focus would be drawn towards the fighting on the pike. I think it's because Custer's out there. Our focus as historians shifts to the back road because of
the big names.
And Rosser and
the whole Rosser-Custer exchange.
That's right.
The fighting equally is equal on both the pike and
just the numbers though is what's different.
It's the numbers, but it's both a simultaneous collapse.
And we don't know for sure how many Confederate cavalrymen were on duty that day. And the reason I say that is they've just marched through the burning. And a lot of the men were from the valley. And it's entirely possible and certainly understandable that some of the men would have dropped out to check on their families, to try and understand and make provisions for them. And this, again, they crossed North River on October 6th, and 3 days later they're at Tom's Brook. That doesn't give them enough time to check on the family, get them situated, and get back. So we don't really know. I've seen numbers for Rosser anywhere from 1,200 to 1,600. So arbitrarily, I always say there's about 1,400. And Lomax, on paper, had 3,000 men. But to be fair, there had been a brigade sent to the Page Valley just in case someone, they'd keep that shenanigans going, because there was also a division of Union cavalry in the Page conducting the same thing back down the Page Valley.
Yeah.
So and he was split up in a lot of detachments. So it's unfortunate. I think I question why only, again, the Valley Pike is the main thoroughfare. Why only the 800 men there, and Rosser's much larger Laurel Brigade and his division back on the back road?
Well, Rosser would have known Custer's on the back road, right?
Oh, I'm sure they
men,
would. Yes,
knowing.
Sure, there'd been captures and things. They knew they were confronting, but he was assigned there. Again, as they broke out across North Mountain, there was an understanding that he was going to go north and Lomax go south. But the other thing, Early had never, after Fitzhugh Lee gets wounded at 3rd Winchester, he does not assign a chief of cavalry.
Yeah.
So
it's independent commands.
Well, they report to Early, but yeah, they're not being given any direct leadership or direction by a cavalry commander. Now, both are West Point trained. You would assume they communicate and understand that importance and what have you. But also, how as you all know, going across the valley is not like drawing a line from A to B and you just ride across. It might take you
all over the place
15, 20 miles to go 5 miles to deliver a message.
Yeah.
So that kind of falls flat in reality when we look at what happens.
And Early may have had and did have probably bigger problems than restructuring and organizing his small, ill-equipped, ill-disciplined cavalry by
no question.
Infantry wins battles. So
yeah, Early even commented to Lee that he said, it'd be better to take the Valley Command and break them up and send them to the infantry.
Yeah.
But he said if I do that, they probably all run off.
Yeah.
They came as cavalry. If we don't cavalry them, we're not going.
Yeah. So Jim, how does this kind of big picture and then immediate aftermath have an effect on the campaign as a whole, and then the war, and how is it remembered?
Well, the devastation of the defeat is not in bodies. Union casualties are like 60.
Yeah.
But Confederate was close to 300, with
So
the vast majority of them being captured.
Yeah.
Estimates are 15% of the Confederate forces involved were casualties. That night, you had one of the outcomes is that night in the back roads near near Kaufman Hill, you have the Union troops returning from the chase from the Woodstock races, and they see their skinny, blonde, long-haired commander trooping around in an oversized uniform of a major general in the Confederate Army. They had captured everybody's baggage wagons, including Thomas Rosser. So Custer is delighted that he had captured Rosser's uniform coat. And he's marching around, he's visiting camps, everybody's having a good time over it. But I think what that was yes, he's rubbing Rosser's nose in it, but I think what he's also was doing, and whether he did intentionally or not, was bolstering that belief now that the Union cavalry really was the king of the battlefield, at least as far as cavalry
King of
goes.
the Valley.
King of the Valley.
Yeah.
Look, I've got the savior of the Valley's jacket. When Rosser came to the Valley, someone, and some even suggesting it had been Rosser himself, had given him the nickname the savior of the Valley. And he certainly didn't do anything to tamp that down. And it was well enough known that Custer and Sheridan and Torbert, they all knew that nickname. They said, we're going to take care of that savior of the Valley. So This was also a way of saying, you just defeated the savior of the valley. You guys are invincible. You guys are kings of the valley now. And I think, but, he's lost, Early's cavalry lost 11 pieces out of 12 in that one day. They lose 56 stands of arms. Or 56,000 rounds of ammunition. They lose all their wagons. They have no supplies left. And what that impact is how do you get your troops to get over that, get them resupplied, and bring morale up that they're ready to take it another shot. Mm-hmm. So I think what happens is one of the very early ramifications when we get to Cedar Creek, and Custer's out on the back road and on that right flank of the Union line, Ross is across the river looking at him, and Ross is saying, I'm not going to attack. I got nothing to, and Early can order me all he wants. I can't do anything against him. They just whipped my tail here 10 days ago, and I've got nothing to replace. So that by the end of the war, this is also happening on the other side of the mountains as well. The Confederate cavalry was a shadow of itself at this point. At the end of the winter of '64, going into '65, Sheridan does say yes to Grant. He told Grant, "I'll be back," and he does. He brings all cavalry back up the valley, across Charlottesville, and goes over to Petersburg. And it's always amazing when you talk to people about this. That you talk about all the activity in Sheridan, the valley, and everything else, and then you say, and he helped block the path of Lee at Appomattox. Mm-hmm. And they go, how do you do that? And of course, that was Custer also being one of the integral people doing that. So to me, as it evolves, it gave that cavalry unit and Sheridan enough confidence to say, we're going to do something unique. Wilson, by the way, does the same thing out west, but something unique. We're going to move an entire army of cavalry and campaign with just cavalry. Wilson does that in the spring of '65. It's very well known. I mean, he had supply. I mean, he planned it to the nth degree. Sheridan didn't do quite that, but at the same time, he initiated this concept of a horse-borne army, and used it very effectively in the valley. And on that retreat north, of course, no infantry arrived. Tom's Brook, Brock's Gap, wherever, all that had been cavalry. So the infantry didn't have much to do until Cedar Creek. So it may explain Cedar Creek a little bit when they get back, that there is this kind of lax attitude of laying out of camps and that sort of the army, because they hadn't had any conflict on the march back north.
With the infantry.
With the infantry. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it could very well be that the successes of Sheridan and Custer and Merritt and what have you on the back road and with the cavalry lulled the Sheridan's army into kind of a sense of...
No pun intended, lulled.
Lulled, there you go. But put them in a position where they, even when they knew Early was advancing, they didn't pay much attention to it.
Mm. It's like this exclamation point followed by an ellipses, and it's just like we're not expecting much after that.
Yeah.
I think it's important for people studying the Valley campaign to not overlook Tom's Brook. I said you're doing yourself a disfavor by overlooking Tom's Brook. And if you study 3rd Winchester to its core, and we covered this in the 3rd Winchester episode, the Federal cavalry's massive influence and effect in that battle, which really begins this growing wave of, within a month, the transition that Federal cavalry has under Sheridan's command, and growth is very impressive, because they're not really used heavily leading up to this in the Valley, with the Mimic War period, with those battles in Jefferson County, and Rutherford's Farm, things like that. You don't see it a whole bunch. But with their success at 3rd Winchester, and then this, and then their effectiveness at Cedar Creek, especially with the end of the battle there, and the lack of Confederate cavalry being involved there at all. I think it was just like Payne's cavalry was the only force used. But I think to understand the Valley Campaign at all and what in the war at 64 here in the Valley, you truly, you get more out of it if you understand the effects, the buildup and the aftermath of Tom's Brook.
Yeah, and I agree with you that Sheridan, I think, brought this concept of using cavalry as a sledgehammer, and that wasn't really orthodox use.
Yeah.
You have that occur at 3rd Winchester, not what is generally known. I know you guys know, but what's generally not known is when we get to Fisher's Hill 3 days after 3rd Winchester, there's only one division of cavalry with Sheridan. Well, what happened to the other two? Well, he had sent them over to Front Royal and up the Page Valley to swing around and get through New Market Gap and block the path of Early when they chase him out of Fisher's Hill. So his concept, his grand strategy around that is really pretty impressive. Now, it didn't happen. Torber got caught at Milford, couldn't get through and what have you, but he was thinking of using the cavalry in that capacity. Then, like I say, Tom's Brook, and then we get to Cedar Creek, and then, of course, I think that gets him to the point where he says in the spring of 65 that I'm going to send the infantry on, either leave them here or send them on back by train. I'm going to go one more time because I haven't wiped Early out yet.
He's still here.
He's
down in the corner.
He's got those 2,000 guys down at Waynesboro, and I'm going to take care of him. But he also, I think, thought that was another way they could come through and destroy the Virginia Central Railroad when they came through Charlottesville there.
Which was another objective of Grant, not one specifically assigned to Sheridan at the outset. You named those 3 at the beginning, but it was something that he knew was on the mind of his commander.
And remember, Sheridan was command at Trevilian Station. And what was the target there?
Virginia Central. Well, the railroads.
The railroads.
Yeah.
So I think he was aware that he kind of didn't. He tried to make that out as a victory at Trevilian. I think what he did was thinking, though, is that I've got to take a railroad out. I can do more help going down and breaking the railroad than if I come around from the north and follow the infantry down through D.C. and around Richmond and into Petersburg. So I think it was a direct call.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to add, Elijah?
I think that the biggest thing with Tom's Brook is not so much the casualties that are inflicted in this battle. It's more so the morale boost that it gives to Union cavalry, but the major impact that it has on Confederate supplies, as we had mentioned. You're going to see that lingering effect even into the Battle of Cedar Creek and into the end of the war, because they've captured all this Confederate ammunition and everything like that, as Jim mentions. At this point late in the war, the Confederate, arsenals and all that other stuff are more so moving southward down into, Macon and Selma and that sort of thing, deep into the South. And they're cut off by Sherman's activities down that way. So it's not so much easy for them to get ammunition northward to Virginia, and the arsenals at Richmond, what ammunition they are still putting out, they're probably sending straight to Lee's defenses around Petersburg. And anything that's coming in from England, as far as that goes,
it's not making its way.
Yeah, it's coming straight to Petersburg and anything on the coast. So these guys are really just ill-equipped from the start and just making the best out of what they've got. And then Sheridan's men don't make it any easier on them.
And there's several mentions in the histories of how poor the horse flesh was by this point within the Confederacy. We think of Stuart and the Black Horse Troop and everything else, and the blooded thoroughbreds and what have you of the beginning of the war. They're all gone. And again, it gets back to whether they had proper food for them and care for the animals as well as the men becomes a major issue. There's an interesting saying, not to be done tonight, but it's also, we always talk about the valley being the breadbasket, and it was. But there's been some scholarship done where someone has made the argument it wasn't by the winter or summer of 64 or the winter of 64 because of all the devastation and fighting back and forth. And that actually, according to quartermaster records, most of the supplies going to Petersburg, foodstuffs, are coming out of Tennessee and Georgia.
Yeah, I've heard this
And
Well, yeah.
it's an interesting concept to think about, because maybe the burning didn't have to occur, but again, it was so set in the mindset.
Well, if it occurred, for what reasons?
For the
did it
reasons.
occur?
For the reasons, yeah.
Yeah. And I always, anyone listening, I encourage you not to look at the burning as it was done because the valley was this breadbasket resource constantly feeding the Confederacy. You have to get that myth out of your head. It's a resource, massive resource for the Confederate Army, but it's not, and it's a good way to describe the valley when you're trying to understand its importance to the overall war. But by like Jim said, by this point in the war, maybe a little bit earlier, it's strategic. It's strategic to military expeditions and campaigns and maneuvers. It does produce massive agricultural products, but it's not.
You're putting Southerners' confidence in check.
Yeah, it's not. Well, yeah, it's not. It is not the. It's not feeding Lee's entire army.
Right.
I mean, sure, it's producing just like anywhere else, but
right.
I believe this recent scholarship
right.
proves that, and that's why Grant, I think, early on. And not to drag this is a whole nother podcast topic, but I think that's why the railroads were the main focus, specifically down by Stanton in the spring of '64. That was, it was transportation. It was whether it was food stuff or physical supplies, eliminating the valley as a transportation ground, as a back door, was, I think, the main focus there. But we can discuss that another day. Jim, is there anything you want to add?
One more thing on that line, though, and something for us to remember is this campaign, September, October, it's harvest time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If of all the foodstuffs that it's going to produce, it's all here. It's not throughout the year. It's at the end of harvest, at the end of the growing season, is when whatever supplies are available.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen in April. You don't have to worry about it in April, but in October, if you're going to do something, that would be the time to go through.
Yeah, I think, what does Grant say? Leave the valley a barren waste, and
Then a crow would have to carry its own provision.
Yeah, I always thought to the point of, I feel like it was more to break down the population. And
that's a whole other podcast.
I know,
I'd
okay.
love to come back for.
I know.
But I would argue that myth is reality. And everyone still assumed it was the breadbasket, whether
That's
it was
true.
or wasn't.
That's true. Once you label it something, it's in your head.
Yeah, and I think Grant, he came east. I mean, he didn't know. He got there in '64, and they said, "Oh yeah, sure, I'll do it." Okay, we need to take it out.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But again, love coming back to that one sometime.
Well, for sure. Well, thank you so much, Jim, for coming on, folks. Jim's book, it's still out there.
Still out
Third
there.
Indiana Cav East Wing. On McFarland Publishing. You can find it there. Is it on Amazon as well?
Still on Amazon as far as I know.
And there's pretty good accounts in there about the Battle of Tom's Brook.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken. You give a good narrative in there.
You have, my interest started with his escort was actually the 3rd Indiana.
Custer's escort.
Custer's escort. So, yeah, that brought my attention to it many, many years ago. So.
Yeah. Well, and from a battlefield, park perspective, hopefully here in the next year or so, some of these recently and long time preserved lands at the Toms Brook battlefield will now be made accessible to the public. So stay tuned for that. Become a member of the Battlefields Foundation. You'll get first word and first person access to these sites to visit these grounds that Jim had talked about. But we thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and like and share with your friends and give us 5 stars, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Thanks, guys.